Okay, sorry about that. This time my microphone died on me. So, technology. Be afraid of technology. Hopefully this one, well, we'll see about this one. But yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, what was I even saying? Basically that we have a lot of common themes here, and that if you but some common themes come from being connected. Other common themes come from maybe just being common themes for humanity. This idea of there was a time when the world was better, or there was a time when the world was worse, and all these creationists seem to want to explain how did we get to where we are now. And what they focus on says a lot about what's important about what things are going on now, whether that's the now of the Native Americans, of the Navajo, of the Aztecs, whether that's the now of Hesiod and his farming, which he hates. All these things kind of say why things are the way they are. Some things they try to justify that are good. Other things they try to they try to provide an explanation for why there are things that are bad. And that's pretty interesting. And so it suggests that these creation myths, they all have a lot in common. Okay, in this video, I want to go on a bit of a world tour, if technology will let me. So here, and let me see if I can just pull up other PowerPoint here. Let's see. Sorry, this might take a second. There, myths around the world, and see how they compare to these ones. Okay, so we looked before a little bit at ones that are similar to the ancient Greek creation myth. We had the Hurrians have their myth of Pumarbi, who like Cronus gets rid of his father's genitals, and like Cronus swallows weird and interesting things. In this case, his father's genitals. But unlike Cronus, becomes pregnant with them, but kind of like Zeus becomes a male pregnant person. And again, this sort of theme, and the three different generations are here. A lot of people have wondered if this is directly connected to the Greeks, or indirectly connected, if it's exploring similar themes, or if the two myths were closely related to each other. There do appear to be some myths where Zeus does the same thing, eats his father's private parts, which is interesting, to say the least, for the themes that we've discussed. But moving on from that to other creation myths around the world that work in a different way, let's take a look at, say, for instance, the creation myth of Japan. Now, there's many creation myths in Japan, but there was one that was particularly important to the emperors of Japan. And this is the story of Izanami and Izanagi. So the world begins as this sort of giant ocean of mist, and Izanami is the first woman, and she is born out of the mist, and Izanagi is the first man, and he is born out of the mist. And what these two basically do is they take a spear and they churn the mist like they're churning butter. They kind of get the mist to congeal, and they make it congeal into these islands, into land out of the water. And then they make their home on these islands. The two, are the original couple. So Izanami gives birth to all these different gods, but eventually she gives birth to fire. And fire, being fire, burns her up and kills her, basically, which is pretty horrible. That's one of the bad things that happens to her in this story. Another is that she's not supposed to speak, and only Izanagi is supposed to speak. But Izanagi is still pretty loyal to her, so he goes to look for her in the land of the dead, and he finds her in the land of the dead. But she says, "Don't look at me," and he breaks his promise, and he does look at her. He holds up the light to see her, and she has become a rotting corpse filled with maggots. And that is because she has become the goddess of the dead, the queen of the dead. And so he flees the underworld and never returns there again. And he becomes kind of a god of life, and she becomes a goddess of death. And then from that last meeting, he spawns the sun, the moon, and a storm god named Susanoo. They spawn from his left eye, his right eye, and his nose. And it's almost kind of like he was made fertile by that last very terrifying encounter and is able to give birth through himself to 3 more gods. The sun god Amaterasu becoming particularly important to the emperor as the ancestor of the emperor. In Norse mythology, we have a creation myth which involves a giant cow, which is always a good time. So the world begins as a kind of void, which is called Guginagap, and that's related to our word gap, an absence, an empty space. But into the empty space, there's hot and cold. There's other worlds which are really hot and really cold, and they flow into this void, and they begin to congeal. And they congeal into the body of a sleeping giant. And the sleeping giant is named Ymir. And Ymir's not doing a whole lot. He's just sleeping. But pretty soon Ymir starts to sweat. And his sweat turns into a giant cow. And the giant cow nourishes him with milk while he's sleeping. So that's how he survives, in case you were wondering. So you can just see the train of logic that came up with this myth. Is that, there's a giant cow. That's how he eats. That's why he doesn't die of starvation. But the giant cow licks a block of ice and turns that into another giant called Buri. Ymir spawns giants from his body, in this singular individual way. Buri has children. It's not clear how. And the children of Ymir become the giants, or the Jotun, who are the enemies of the gods. And the children of Buri become the gods, the Aesir. And the gods, they chop Ymir up into pieces and make the world out of his body. So that's pretty scary. Later on, we're going to look at another myth where people do that. But that seems to be, another way of explaining where does the world come from. Well, the gods made it out of somebody. Let's see. We may be running out of time here, so we might or might not get cut off. But in the Egyptian creation myth, we have a primordial mound of earth. So the world was all water. And if you think about Egypt and the Nile River, that makes a lot of sense. That there was just some mud in the water, but it hadn't really congealed yet. But eventually the mud kind of comes together and makes this solid mound. And this mound is fertile soil that's good for growing things. And it becomes basically the world. The world emerges out of this water. And the sun god emerges out of the mound of earth. And depending on what story, that could be Ra, that could be Khepri, the scarab beetle who pushes the sun around in the sky. And other gods are children of Ra or children of Khepri. And these gods begin to shape the mound into the world and to create Egyptian civilization. And along the sky and the earth, as we saw before, are some of the children of the sun god, and they have to be separated so that their children can come to the world and the world can exist. Okay, I think, let's see. I'd like to end the recording here, but once again we are experiencing technical difficulties. The button has disappeared. So I'm just going to run out the clock on this one, I guess. Oh boy. We'll run out the clock on this one, and then I'll meet you in the next video to finish up with the last few thoughts on creation myths here.